as well as the videos, are all recorded. So if you want to share some of this with your colleagues, feel free to click on the notes link that we'll paste in the chat window. It's only 25 bucks, gives you all the notes from the summit today and all the recordings as well. We also have a digital fundraising course. You want to take your fundraising from 0 to 10,000 in 30 days. Check us out. We'll include that link as well. Want to make sure that you guys know that with all of you at the summit today, you have discounts. We're going to send out these discounts via email after the summit. So for example, 20% off Zoom, you got 20% off philanthropy, you got 20% off Cosmox, lots of great things over here. So where we are today, right now, is we're on the tail end of our summit. We have Sharon Cody is going to talk about a checklist for online fundraising. And then after that, we have a donor cultivation session. And then that's it. Then you have all your Friday back. So the Digital Fundraising Summit is presented by Cosmox. And I want to give thanks to some of our sponsors, Harbor Compliance, as well as Joe Goresh Fundraising. Thank you so much for supporting our Digital Fundraising Summit today. Sharon is actually from Harbor Compliance, so this is going to be great. I want to thank all of our speakers as well. So without further ado, Sharon, are you ready to go? Candace,
I'm ready.
As well. Okay. So I think Candace actually took some thunder from you. I think you were supposed to introduce Sharon. So.
That's okay. I'm excited to hear from Sharon though, so
okay.
Why don't you just take it away?
Yeah, Sharon, why don't you take it away? Feel free. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share your slides.
Okay, great. Thank you. So welcome everybody. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start by just sharing the slides, and I'll probably move back into just letting you listen to me talk as we get towards the end when I'm answering your questions, okay?
Sounds great, Sharon.
Okay. Okay. So.
Yep, we can see your slides, and then it looks like you're about to do presentation mode.
Okay.
Great. Looks perfect. Audio sounds good. Webcam looks great too.
Great. So welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about digital fundraising compliance. So the way I think of compliance as something that is an engine of success for nonprofits and a way to protect their brand and reputation. So we'll talk a little bit about Harbor Compliance. We partner with nonprofits in every state in over 25 countries to help them solve their most challenging compliance problems. We have clients ranging from the largest nonprofits in the country to fast-growing startups. And some of the nonprofits that we've worked with in the past are shown here on the screen. Okay? All right. I think the best place to start is with a shared definition of what we're talking about when we talk about nonprofit compliance. So nonprofit compliance is the act of meeting the requirements of best practices, legislation, prescribed rules and regulation to maintain your not-for-profit status and good standing with the IRS and the various state and local authorities that regulate nonprofits. So the next thing is who benefits from nonprofit compliance? Okay, the state regulators protect the general public when they regulate nonprofit compliance, but additional people benefit from nonprofit compliance as well. All the members of the team that fuels your nonprofit success. The staff, the board of directors, your volunteers, your donors, your funders, your corporate sponsors, your other nonprofit partners, and members of the community. All those folks benefit in addition to the general public. How does nonprofit compliance benefit all these individuals? Well, it safeguards the reputation and brand of the nonprofit and its staff. It protects nonprofits' leadership and board. It encourages individual donations, it expands grant funding, it helps a nonprofit attract and retain good quality staff. It could allow you to broaden your reach to new revenue sources, additional foundation funders or corporate sponsors, and most importantly of all, being a compliant nonprofit will prevent disruptions to your service, to your mission, and help you continue to be able to meet the needs of all the folks you serve, okay? And of course, we all know it reduces your nonprofit's risk. Okay, let's talk about nonprofit compliance, all right? We're gonna go back for a second. So nonprofit compliance regarding fundraising consists mostly of charitable solicitation registration. So what is that? The IRS requires, the IRS notes that most states have laws that regulate the solicitation of funds for charitable purpose, and that many of the states have statutes which require nonprofits both to register with the state agency before they solicit the state's residents for donations, and then, or apply to the state for an exemption from that registration. And then the second half of charitable solicitation registration is filing periodic financial reports with the states in which you're registered or exempted, okay? So in the US, 41 different states require nonprofits to register before they solicit their state's residents. So now is usually a part where you ask, do these rules apply to my nonprofit? And here's the answer. Generally speaking, most nonprofits have to register in any state where they solicit donations. So what does solicitation mean? The way most states define solicitation is fundraising of any sort, whether it be through events, grant applications, seeking corporate sponsorships, or engaging in digital fundraising. Fundraising online is generally considered by the states to be soliciting nationwide, because things like donate now buttons or support sections on nonprofit websites are solicitations that, at least in theory, reach people in every state. So additional methods like sending e-newsletters with solicitations or soliciting on social media also reach people nationwide. So it's important to understand that it's the act of soliciting that triggers the charitable solicitation registration requirements, not the receipt of donations from an individual in a state. Many people misunderstand this. The law in every state is, if you want to solicit, you must comply with the state's requirements to be registered or exempt before you begin soliciting within the state, not after. Okay, now every state does exclude certain types of nonprofits from registration obligations, typically religious nonprofits, educational institutions, and nonprofits who serve veterans and first responders, as well as very small nonprofits who raise $5,000 or less total nationally in a year are exempt from registration in the majority of states. But each state often has its own additional laws about certain nonprofits that may seek exempt status. While the requirements for charitable solicitation registration have existed for a long time, states are more recently becoming much more stringent with enforcement of these regulations. State agencies have hired CPAs, prosecuting attorneys, as members of full-time staff to audit, investigate, and prosecute charities. An Urban Institute study recently that surveyed state nonprofit regulators found that fundraising abuses were their most common area of enforcement. What happens if you don't register? Well, in addition to damage to your reputation, the reputation of your nonprofit team, You could miss grant opportunities, donation opportunities, but you could also risk enforcement actions, audits, fines, penalties, even revocation of your right to solicit, or loss of a state's recognition of your tax-exempt status. None of these things any of us want to face. So we're going to talk about how to work your way through doing an annual compliance review to find out what your nonprofit should be doing in which states, and how to go about budgeting and planning to become compliant in those states if you're not already compliant, okay? Once we discuss this, we'll talk about all the different parts that you need to monitor annually to make sure you stay compliant in the states, all right? Let's begin by talking about different types of fundraising that may prompt additional changes to your regular compliance obligations, okay? So maybe you're pursuing one type of fundraising now, but you're looking at expanding your fundraising, and you should look at that. Certain types of fundraising require additional compliance obligations. Certain types of fundraising events, online fundraising, grant applications, radio or TV ads, membership dues, auctions, bingos, raffles, and games that you may conduct often require certain additional compliance obligations, often regulated at a county or local level. And then hiring a professional solicitor or fundraising consultant for a capital campaign requires a separate fundraising application in each individual state where you're going to be doing the fundraising. It also requires the filing of the contracts you have with those two types of individuals. A final area that often requires additional compliance requirements in a number of states is commercial co-ventures. So maybe you've been fortunate enough to find a really supportive corporate partner, and they want to do point of sale donations and give a percentage to, or something similar. Well, those commercial co-ventures in many states require additional compliance obligations. Okay, so this slide shows you which states require fundraising registration or require nonprofits to apply for exemption from their fundraising registration statutes. There are 40 states, as well as the District of Columbia, that require nonprofits to register before they solicit the residents of that state. The remaining 10 states don't have obligations for charitable solicitation registration, but a few of those do have some requirements that nonprofits make certain types of disclosure statements when they fundraise. Now, we've discussed that nonprofits need to conduct research to decide whether they need to register or apply for exemption in states. Nonprofits need to take a look at where they're currently soliciting donations and where they're currently receiving donations from donors, where they're soliciting grants, where they're receiving grants, where they're soliciting corporate sponsorships, and where they're receiving them. Once you have all that information and look prospectively at the types of fundraising you're going to be doing in the next year and what states, additional states, you may wish to register in as well, you then have a list of the states where you're going to conduct a little additional research. So nonprofits may have to take care of some ancillary fundraising prerequisites before they fill out the application for charitable solicitation registration. There are 4 states that require nonprofits to foreign qualify, that is, register as an out-of-state corporation doing business with a particular state. And there are additional 11 states that require nonprofits to appoint a registered agent within that state. A registered agent is an office where someone is located during business hours to accept government letters and legal paperwork on behalf of the nonprofit. So those two additional requirements need to be taken care of before you can submit your fundraising registration application. So compliance solicitation registration is a multi-step process, and it includes registering or applying for exemption, submitting additional paperwork with the application, such as your IRS Form 90, list of board of directors members, etc. And then the second part is, once you are registered, you need to submit some sort of regular financial reporting to the states in which you're registered. Many states refer to this as an annual report. Now, I know in the nonprofit world, an annual report is usually the wonderful summary of your organization's accomplishments that you share with donors and prospective donors so they understand the impact that their dollars are having. This is not that type of annual report. This is an annual financial reporting that updates the state on your nonprofit operations, your fundraising in that state, and your general practices. Typically, annual reports are not annual. They are biannual. In Pennsylvania, where I live, they're every 10 years. They must be submitted. But even if you are exempt from registration in a state, you are still obligated to submit this annual report in the state. So every state where you're registered or exempt is going to require some sort of regular annual report be filed as well. Okay. All right. So this is very burdensome, this type of research, the amount of time that staff must spend looking into all this. It's also quite expensive. State fees vary depending on what a nonprofit's annual revenue is, but annual state fees for nationwide fundraising registration in those 40 states and the District of Columbia total usually somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 for most nonprofits. $2,000 and $5,000 a year. Organizations with revenue under $100,000 would be at the lower end, closer to the $2,000 a year mark, and nonprofits with more than $1 million in annual revenue would be closer to the $5,000, the high end of that range. Okay, so here are two practical approaches your nonprofit can take when deciding what states they're going to register for charitable solicitation. You can register or file an exemption in all 41 states, really 40 states in the District of Columbia, or your nonprofit could choose not to accept online donations in any states where your nonprofit is not registered. The most comprehensive way to be compliant would be to move forward and register in all 41 states, or seek exemption from registration in those states. But for many nonprofits with tight budgets and a big mission, registering all 41 states is just not practical. They just don't have the ability to do that. So for these nonprofits, putting a disclaimer on your support page, on the page where your Donate Now button appears, that says you are only registered in a number of states, and those states, you list those states, and then letting folks know that you are not able to accept donations from residents in any other state. Okay. It provides an alternative from the time drain and expense of registering nationally for those nonprofits that just don't have that current ability. Registering nationally, if you're engaged in digital fundraising and you have donate now buttons and are sending newsletters out with solicitations to a large database of folks all over the US, is really a best practice. But if it's not practical for your nonprofit, there's an additional alternative. Skip over that. Okay, now we talked about ancillary requirements that states have other than the charitable solicitation, registration, and annual reporting obligations. 24 states require nonprofits to have fundraising disclosures. Each state, unfortunately, has their own specific language that they want nonprofits to place on solicitations, whether they be digital solicitations or any sort of solicitations via mail or email. This language is several sentences long for each state, and with 24 states wanting their own language, you can see that it could really take quite a lot of space on your web page. There are ways to come up with sort of general fundraising disclosure and then some specific additions that will meet the obligations of all 24 states. And I encourage you to take a look on the internet and see if you can find a template for that type of nationwide disclosure language. But when you put the disclosures on your website, a tip that I would suggest you think about is, rather than hiding it in a smaller font at the bottom of the page, including it prominently on that site and adding some additional language before the disclosure, saying that you are proud to be registered nationwide, that your organization values transparency and accountability. It is an opportunity for your nonprofit to win trust and boost donations by adding this language to your website. It builds donor trust and builds donor donations. I was recently talking to a former head of one of the state bureaus of charitable organizations. He works for a law firm now and does a lot of fundraising registrations for nonprofits. He told me that he has a number of nonprofit clients that do not need to be registered in several states, but choose to register anyway because they wish to be able to say on their website and in their marketing materials that they are registered nationwide. They think the additional money they raise by making that claim more than makes up for the fees to register in states where they don't really have to be. So that's some food for thought. Okay, we talked about what annual reports are, your annual financial obligations to follow up with the states where you're registered or exempt. We've talked about the fact that annual reports are not always annual. The deadlines for those annual reports are also very variable and can occur at any time throughout the year. So you need to carefully track those due dates because the penalties, if you're late, can be quite costly. Okay, we discussed registered agent, your legal appointee to receive notice on your behalf in a handful of states being required. And we talked about the 4 jurisdictions where nonprofits need to apply for foreign qualification before submitting an application for fundraising, registration, or exemption. Finally, there are 11 jurisdictions that, want those registered agent services. Some of them are also the ones where they want foreign qualification, but not, there are additional ones that want only for qualification and not registered agent. Okay, so here's a to-do list for how your nonprofit can determine and budget for the cost of nonprofit fundraising compliance. Perform an assessment of the current requirements and confirm in any states where you are registered whether you're up to date with your registration. All this information can be accessed online quite easily. You compile a list of additional states where you need to be registered. Look at analyzing what your future fundraising compliance requirements might be as you expand the types of fundraising you engage in, as you perhaps open offices in other states, or withdraw and stop fundraising or stop doing business with certain states. And then after you have all that information, you'll be in a position to take a look at the state fees based on your annual revenue and determine how much you're going to pay to obtain registration or exemption in all those states. Once you have the budget, the next step is to create a compliance calendar showing the due dates for every single state's fundraising, registration, renewal, and annual report. And then you need to schedule compliance reminders for your staff at the nonprofit. So here are some suggested tips. Consolidate all these compliance tasks in one department at your nonprofit. But I would suggest that there's shared responsibility for these tasks. I recently read that the annual term of a staff member at a nonprofit is under 18 months at present. And I'm sure most of you know about staff turnover. Staff turnover doesn't lead to adherence to deadlines. And a way to make up for that is to make sure that automatic reminders of due dates are shared with multiple people within the organization, so there's some continuity as staff changes. Finally, an additional way to think about maintaining your compliance in all these states is to automate as much of the process as you can with compliance software, or to integrate these deadlines into your existing software, so you have a way to track it throughout the changes in staffing. Okay? All right. Now that you know where you need to be registered, where you are registered, how much it will cost to be registered on an annual basis, and how to really think about how much staff time is going to be required to get registered and maintain registration, you are ready to have that big conversation with nonprofit management and your nonprofit's board of directors. We're going to talk about some tips on starting that conversation within your organization. So now that you have the information gathered, what are next steps? I would suggest looking for allies on the staff and board. Many of our nonprofit clients have found members of their finance and audit committee to understand very well the need for compliance. Choosing an appropriate time to have this lengthy discussion with leadership and with the board, making sure it appears on the agenda with enough time budgeted to really look carefully at the costs, risks, and benefits of fundraising compliance. Consider sharing the materials from today's session with the folks. Think a little bit ahead of time about what people's likely concerns are going to be. Do a detailed risk-benefit analysis and provide it to folks in advance of the meeting. And then make a specific recommendation or request about what you would like your leadership or board to do. Some of our nonprofit clients have decided, rather than registering in every state where they need to be in 1 year, they're going to spread the cost over several years and build up to be able to achieve nationwide registration. So they'll register the first year in the states where they have the largest fundraising footprint, register in additional states the following year, and complete the registration in the remaining states maybe in year 3. Many of them do this in anticipation of a large capital campaign or a special anniversary campaign to make sure that by the time they're really aggressive in fundraising nationwide, that they are fully compliant and not putting the campaign at risk. So that's certainly a strategy. I also want to suggest some experiences our nonprofit clients have had when looking for how to fund compliance. We've had several nonprofit clients that have built the cost of nationwide fundraising registration into the budget for their capital campaign or next large fundraising initiative. We've had nonprofit clients that have written capacity building grants in order to pay for the initial year's fundraising registration nationwide. And finally, a number of our nonprofit clients have found that the members of their finance and audit committees are often willing to make additional donations in order to fund charitable solicitation registration, because those folks are very compliance oriented and very supportive of the charity achieving full nationwide registration. Okay, now we're going to talk about action steps. So the 2 main takeaways I'm hoping that you'll go home with after this session is that you should consider nationwide charitable solicitation registration as a growth strategy for your nonprofit, as an opportunity to fundraise in different ways, to fundraise with more organizations, to get partnerships with maybe larger foundations and corporate sponsors that are more careful about investigating the nonprofits that they'll work with, that look at nonprofits, charitable registrations in states before they decide to take them on as a partner. So thinking about charitable solicitation registration as a growth strategy, a way to increase fundraising and therefore impact for your organization. The other key takeaway that I'd like you to leave with is discussing outsourcing of these duties as a way to keep your nonprofit efficient and focused on mission and impact. So most nonprofits outsource their legal work to law firms, their financial reporting obligations to CPA firms. They don't try to do these things in-house because it requires specialized knowledge, and they're willing to make the investment to have professionals take care of this. You may want to think about fundraising compliance this way and think about hiring a compliance firm or law firm to take care of the research and applications and renewals of fundraising solicitation registration in the states where you're going to be working on keeping your nonprofit compliant. Okay, so these are 2 sort of main thoughts I hope you leave here today with. Okay, so yeah, if anybody wants to contact me, needs additional information, you can. There's my phone number, my email. I'd also suggest that you take a look at the Harbor Compliance website. We have a lot of resource materials on the site. There's a number of white papers that we've authored there. one on charitable solicitation registration that was co-branded and authored by the National Council for Nonprofits, that details a lot of what we've talked about today. And it's a great resource available for download and the kind of thing you could share with your leadership or board members before you have a detailed conversation about whether your nonprofit's going to work to become compliant in all the states where it's fundraising. That's about it. Does anybody have any questions for me based on the conversation?
Hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for walking us through compliance. It really is an essential part of what every nonprofit needs to do when they're fundraising. And we couldn't appreciate you more for all of the insights and really walking us through step by step. It's so practical and so essential. So we have actually quite a few questions for you. So I wanted to first go over just a quick clarification question from someone who chatted us in. They were asking, just to confirm, does this mean if we're running an online fundraising campaign, we must apply for compliance in 41 states?
Yes, that is what I'm saying. The general thinking of the regulators in the 41 jurisdictions where fundraising registration is required is that online fundraising, digital fundraising gives people throughout the United States the ability to be solicited by your organization, and therefore you have an obligation to either register in each one of those states, or if your nonprofit meets the requirements of some of those states' exemptions, to apply for exemption in those states. That is right. And I know a lot of nonprofits are shocked to learn this. Mm-hmm. And I've had nonprofits say, well, gosh, why didn't my auditor tell me? Why didn't the attorney that's on my board of directors or the CPA that's on the board of directors, why didn't they let me know? You know, who's supposed to know about that? And the answer is leaders of nonprofits are expected to be familiar with the laws and regulations governing the business that they're in. And that includes fundraising registration. As a practical matter, many nonprofits are unaware of this obligation, but you know, you need to do a risk-benefit analysis of whether you want to register in some or all those states. But as far as the state nonprofit regulators are concerned, you need to be registered in all the states or apply for exemption from registration in the states.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. And Vicki asked, if you have the option to donate on your website, would that still mean that you have to register in all states?
Yes, it would, because anyone from any state can view your website, and therefore you are soliciting all those people. And remember, the need to register for a license to fundraise in a state is triggered by you soliciting there, not you receiving donations from a donor or a foundation in that state. So if you have a Donate Now button on your website, you are soliciting nationwide, whether you receive donations from some of those states or not. You are making the ask, and the ask is what triggers the obligation to register.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And this is a similar question. It's from an anonymous attendee. And they ask, if our e-newsletters have a donate button, do we have to go as far as putting a disclaimer, only sign up for our newsletter if you live in XYZ states?
I'm sorry, Candace.
So should nonprofits, if they currently don't have solicitation compliance in 41 states. To get around it in the meantime, to make sure that they're complying currently, should they only suggest that people sign up for their newsletter if they live in a certain state that they have the compliance in?
I think that would depend on whether your newsletter includes a solicitation or not. Sharing information with people in every state will not trigger the obligation for you to register for charitable solicitation in those states. However, if your newsletter asks for funds from the people who are reading it, and I certainly hope it does, you're missing an opportunity to raise dollars if it doesn't. And if your newsletter does include an ask, then yes, you need to either tell donors not to sign up for it or put some sort of disclaimer in it that you hope donors everywhere are enjoying the information about your mission and impact, but that the solicitations in the newsletter really are only intended to reach folks in, and then list all the states where you are registered.
Thanks so much for tackling that question. That's a great answer. That really helps clarify what they need to do. So something else that was brought up by one of our viewers, Bettina, asked, what if you're a group that isn't a nonprofit, but hold an event and fundraise for a nonprofit organization? What are some good steps for them as they seek to remain compliant?
So if you are an organization that's not a nonprofit, but you regularly fundraise for a nonprofit?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so since you are not a nonprofit, you do not have an obligation, but the nonprofit needs to be aware of who's soliciting on its behalf. So if the nonprofit empowers its supporters to go out and fundraise, in a way they use a digital platform and set it up for their supporters to do peer-to-peer fundraising and give the supporters the tools to solicit on their behalf. That nonprofit needs to register in every place where those supporters are asking for money. If this is a group that the nonprofit is either not familiar with or who raises money without the nonprofit's support, guidance, and tools, and then makes the donation to the nonprofit, that's a different thing. And that group will not have any sort of charitable fundraising registration requirement, and the nonprofit is likely not to have any obligations triggered by that group making the donation. Every year at Christmas, the holiday time, I go to a luncheon, and the luncheon includes a basket being passed around, and everybody makes donations, and the group that's there for the lunch votes on which of our local community nonprofits is going to get the donation that we collectively make. And we contact the nonprofit and we give them the check. The nonprofit hasn't asked us to do that, and has given us tools, materials, you know, anything to enable us to fundraise on their behalf, and therefore the nonprofit doesn't have any reporting obligations triggered by receipt of our fundraising check that we've done separate and apart from them. I hope that clears it up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sharon. And I think we have time for just one more question. Holly asked, my treasurer thinks our 501c3 doesn't raise enough to trigger a need to register. Is there a certain amount that triggers the need to register for compliance?
Every state has a different threshold, and most states generally look at what a nonprofit's annual revenue is. Often the level is $15,000 to $25,000 a year, and that's in any state. So if your nonprofit's raising at that level or above it, you're likely going to be obligated to register in many states where you're fundraising. New York has a different threshold. It looks at both what you're raising annually as well as what you're raising within the state of New York when determining whether you need to register there. Every state does not require any nonprofits whose annual revenue level is $5,000 or below to register or apply for exemption. That's uniform throughout all the 41 jurisdictions. So if you're between $5,000 and $15,000 or $20,000 in annual revenue, you may or may not be required to register. It sort of depends on the state. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that really does. Thank you so much, Sharon. I so appreciate you walking us through all of that. If you'd like to stay on, there's still a few questions in there. You could always type answers to people if you're interested. And yeah, well, this was such a great session. I think it was super informative. And for anyone that is interested in more information, they can go to harborcompliance.com to learn more about staying compliant. So thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Wonderful. All right, we have a really quick break here. I'll just put up a slideshow for just a second, but really we're going to start rolling into our next session shortly. Coming to the tail end of our day here. Again, oh yeah, we can just roll right into it just to stay on track. And again, if anyone wants the notes from today's discussion, in the chat pane, we've included the link to buy notes and access to the recordings for $25.